On a special edition of VLGA Connect, we've brought together a panel to talk about the long-term economic impact of COVID-19 on the local government sector. I'd like to introduce our panel members, starting with Kathryn Arndt, who is the CEO of the VLGA. Welcome, Kathryn, and great to have you on our panel.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be here.
Also, we have John Comrie, who's the chair of the Local Government Finance Authority in South Australia and has also been involved in some of the finance regime that is in place in Victoria currently. John Comrie, hello.
Hello, Chris. Good afternoon all.
And Matthew Wilson, the Executive Director at Pitcher Partners, joins us to provide a more broad perspective on the economic impacts of COVID-19 to our panel. Matthew, welcome.
Yes, thank you.
So the proposition for our discussion today is simply that most councils, if not all, are under some sort of pressure at the moment to provide relief, whether it's to residents, whether it's to the business community or others, due to impacts of COVID-19. And I think it's really important that we consider what the long-term implications of this are going to be. One of the most common things we're hearing is communities wanting rate relief or rate deferrals. And I thought one thing that might be useful is to understand, is there a difference in those concepts? And then, what will that mean on the long-term basis? John, if I could perhaps start with you, because I know you have a view around whether rate relief or rate deferral would be whether one or the other would be a more responsible thing for councils to be considering.
Thank you, Chris. Look, a couple of things I would say there. I've done some work in Victoria previously. I'm aware of the changes in the reforms to the legislation that's about to come through. Victoria has probably been a little bit, unusually, but a little bit behind on this issue compared with the other states. Really important for councils to consider the longer term projections, revenue and expenditure in their budget decision making. One of the challenges we've got here with COVID is it's a bit hard. Is this going to be a short-term issue and everything gets back to normal in 3 or 6 months, or is it going to go on for some years? For those reasons, I'd probably be urging councils to focus on the deferral issue at this point in time. Deferral as in, you don't have to pay today, but there is still a debt on the property and we'll claim it in future. In future might be next year when everything's back to normal. It might be in the much longer term, or even we decide after in the medium term, look, it was a deferral, but we're now prepared to effectively cancel that debt. And so I'd be saying take a cautious approach initially.
And John, what would you say about the issue of generally there would be interest accruing on unpaid or deferred rates? Is that to be, do you think, deferred as well?
Look, there's been, in fact, I chair the Local Government Finance Authority in South Australia, which is effectively a bank or provides borrowings to local government. Most states have similar arrangements, although Victoria is, again, the odd one out on that one. I guess I'm saying that we need to think a little bit about borrowings. I think deferring rates, councils in Victoria have traditionally been a bit adverse to borrowing money, and all that's true of local government throughout the nation. But if you do defer rates, if you don't collect it, there's not as big a charge involved as people sometimes think. In South Australia, for example, councils can borrow at about 2.2% from the LGFA. Banks are not going to be that much different. You defer $1 million worth of rates. People say $1 million, that's a lot of money. I'd probably express it in terms of, well, if you had to borrow for that $1 million to keep the services flowing, to keep the staff employed, to do the things that the community wants, the net cost to your community is not $1 million. It's about $22,000 for the year. It's not a big amount. You could effectively collect that money down the track. $22,000 sounds a lot better to me than $1 million. So I'd just be saying, think about your long-term needs, capacities, circumstances in making that decision. Clearly, some councils are going to be in a stronger position than others, but think about your own circumstances, your own long-term needs before you jump into a particular course of action.
Kathryn, what are you hearing from your members in particular as they're grappling with these issues at the moment around rate relief, rate deferral or borrowings, as John has just mentioned?
Thanks, Chris. Look, of course, it's a front of mind issue for the sector. As you would appreciate, a lot of councils have made decisions to defer the collection of, or even just cease collecting revenue through parking infringements or metered parking. Of course, that will have an impact on revenue. In addition, they're losing revenue through the closure, forced closure perhaps of some of their services such as gymnasiums and swimming pools. But I think they are also looking to the state government for some leadership around raising community awareness about actually the extent of the services that councils do, I guess, provide for their community. We have a situation where there are, of course, ratepayers and residents calling for some sort of rate relief or deferral and not really understanding the extent or the impact that might have on the council's ability to deliver services into the future. And I like John's point. I mean, of course, rate deferral will have a cumulative effect over time, but councils, I think, need to look innovatively at how they may be able to, as John suggested, borrow some money in the interim to enable them to continue to provide those critically important services.
Matthew, can we take any cues from other sectors here? Is there anything you're seeing on how these particular issues are being dealt with perhaps more innovatively than perhaps government sectors traditionally do?
I'd probably make a few observations around the conversation in the before that. I think John's comments are good. To me, this is a common decision that every organisation is facing about the current crisis and what that means on income streams and expenditure and how to match the two, indeed, how to reduce costs such that you don't come out of the back end of this with what we call a bit of a debt balloon. And when you come out of the back end of this, if you do come out with a debt balloon, do you have an understanding of how you're going to repay that and service that debt? And I think every council is going to have a different view on what their appetite for debt is and whether or not they're trading off short-term decisions for long-term benefits that the community expects. And obviously in a time of crisis, that trade-off is a larger, shorter-term impact where you're trying to continue to deliver services around children's and families and health and well-being, and that trade-off may well be in relation to some of the infrastructure and projects that you might do down the track. So I think every organisation has got to take a strategic lens here. I think a quick decision's obviously needed, but I don't think a knee-jerk decision is the way to go. Because you could ultimately impact your ability longer term to deliver the services that you need to deliver to the community. Now, what that means from an organisation perspective, and I don't think councils are any different, is you've got to stress test those scenarios that you might see. You know, what is the impact on our community's ability to come out of the back end of this with jobs intact and the ability to meet their obligations to rates and other areas of their own expenditure, and how long, you know, to John's point, is that going to go on for? I don't think taking a 12-month view is the right way to go here. It's certainly a 12, 18, 24-month view that we need to take. And as long as there is a sight of how that debt would be repaid, and in the concept of deferring rates, I think John's right. A deferral of the rates gives the council the ability to understand that yes, there is an ability to repay this down the track, and they can manage it accordingly. In terms of other sectors, obviously there's a lot of support coming for businesses in relation to employment. The JobKeeper initiatives and other grant programs coming out from government are designed to give organisations, I think, the ability either to reduce or refocus their cost base where it needs to be moving forward. I think the challenge for local government is some of those initiatives may not be there, so they need to look at what their internal financial positions are to fund this. And to Kathryn's perspective, I think you know, some direction from government down into the local governments would be welcome in that context as well. So I think you've got to take a strategic lens here. Those businesses that move through these times that do that often come out stronger at the back end of that.
So Matt and Kathryn, you've both mentioned something that occurs to me that I think could do with a little more unpacking, and that is for want of a better expression, the knee-jerk reactions, or perhaps the decisions that respond to public calls to turn off parking meters or to not collect parking infringements, etc. And indeed, John might have a view on this. With respect to those councils that have made those decisions, you don't know what's gone into them, but there doesn't appear to be a lot of strategic thinking around those. They're very instant decisions made to potentially appease people. And when you think about parking meters, people aren't travelling to the shops like they would be anyway. So what's the long-term implication of that? Would anyone like to tackle that one? Because surely it's going to be harder to turn them back on without a strategic justification for why you've turned them off in the first place.
Well, look, I'll kick off here. I think, as you would appreciate, Chris, councils often do have front of mind the community sense of health and well-being, and it was in fact a very immediate thing that they could do to relieve some, or be perceived to be relieving some of that pressure on their community, just taking that other level of anxiety off. But what is the extent of that? How long into the future will that look? I'm not entirely clear. I think as we move through this pandemic situation, the stages of lockdown and self-isolation, I think councils will be as agile in turning that back on. What the challenges might be that it's associated with that, I think, won't be dissimilar to many other sectors where the way in which we all work, and even what was business as usual, will perhaps become, there'll be expectations that things will be done slightly differently in the future. And I think that will be a challenge for councils as well.
John, do you have thoughts on that?
The parking's an interesting one, and most councils, it's a small amount of revenue. For some of the bigger urban, it's more significant. I strongly have a view, though, that you've got to think about parking revenue in terms of why are we doing it, and probably we shouldn't be looking at it focusing on to generate revenue. Parking's there as a service, and we want to charge so that we can rotate parks so that we can give everybody a reasonable opportunity to support the business community. If demand falls, then I think we've probably just got to cop that. But you know, I'd always be selling parking on the idea of why we're doing it, and it's not about revenue raising. The other point about parking is, and it's true in rates as well, what we're experiencing at the moment is not a typical recession. A typical recession, there's a loss of confidence, there's a loss of demand, and governments typically respond by, you know, additional public expenditure to keep people active, to keep businesses active. This one's not that at all. Many people have not been significantly affected to date. They've got a job where they're still earning an income. I've had a council recently in South Australia that has effectively cancelled rates for a quarter. That council, though, was a country council. Possibly the majority of its revenue came from farmers. Well, farmers' income's probably not going to have an immediate impact because of this. So you really do need to think about, is the support or the relief we're providing targeted and appropriate to you know, the people we're there to serve? And if, you know, so I'm a little bit cautious. I realise there's administrative issues here, but we just need to think a little bit about, are the people in need going to get the benefits from this, or are we going to provide those more broadly, that down the track somewhere we might regret that because either we can't do as many services as we otherwise would have. So yeah, we just need to think a bit more strategically rather than that short-term issue.
Kathryn.
And yes, that's certainly been what's come through in the conversations I've had with mayors and CEOs. Applying a blanket approach to any of these strategies is perhaps not, well, it has risks, doesn't it, as John said, and it might be that, for example, if you apply a blanket percentage reduction on rates, for example, that will benefit some people in the community who perhaps don't actually require that benefit as others do. So councils are very mindful of that, and that's why I think going back to the earlier point about trying to look more innovatively at how they do this and strategically to pick up that points as well.
I think there's a timing issue there as well. To John's point, not everyone's feeling the same impact currently across the board, which is not to say in 3 months' time it's going to not be felt by those people not feeling it today. And keeping your powder dry to have initiatives that'll help your community, that's targeted for your community, and what's going on in different aspects of your community, gives more options for a council to assist the people that they need to assist. I think sometimes, though, there is also a bit of a branding and a reputation issue here, and something like parking. If I just think about that and step back a moment, no one likes to be hit with a parking fine in this sort of environment where, John, to your point, it's not about revenue raising, it's about managing demand for services and keeping people moving through. And when that's not really required, having a parking fine it doesn't make sense. And so then it becomes a much greater penalty in this environment than it otherwise would. And I don't think you can apply that discussion to a rates discussion.
Good point. Kathryn?
Yes, and look, I feel like I'm responsible for bringing up the parking issue. But I actually just left not long ago a Zoom meeting and had about 250 participants with Jim Chalmers, and talking about the concept of debt, and I guess reshaping the narrative to not talk so much about debt, but in fact, what's the quality of the expenditure? And I think that's what we're talking about here as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Kathryn, because I wanted to bring it to, there's a couple of other topics I'd like to introduce, but I wanted to get back to that debt question, and John might have a view on this. It's always intrigued me a bit that councils have been conservative, or many councils are conservative when it comes to taking on debt, whereas the individuals that make up councils would all have mortgages, I expect, and would all understand the concept of borrowing against tomorrow for use now. Why is that conservatism there? And John, do you see that changing?
Look, it's gradually changing, Chris. Certainly across the nation, encouraging councils over the last decade to focus on asset management, to focus on long-term financial planning is helping. There's still a long way to go, though. I like to say to people, look, a couple of things that are relatively unique about local government. We are very, very infrastructure intensive, far more than the state or Commonwealth governments. What that means, and it's mainly roads, but it's not only roads and stormwater drainage and everything else. There's big upfront capital costs. How do you equitably spread those costs over the beneficiaries over time? And the answer is we shouldn't think about, how much cash we need this year and raise that from ratepayers. We should think about what's an intergenerationally equitable, fair charge to recover full costs. Inevitably, that is likely to mean that councils need to use debt, and more debt than a state or Commonwealth government would, simply because we're far more asset intensive. You're interested. It's an interesting question to say about why are councils so debt adverse. Partly it's because we haven't focused on long-term planning. It's also partly, to be frank, because council members traditionally doing I think a very acting responsibly, but they apply their own circumstances often. They see themselves as maybe they're a little bit older, and I've worked hard to pay off my debt, and now the last thing people tell me at my stage in life is that I should be taking on more debt. And so there's some people have that view. Others might be in primary production areas that their income is volatile, and they know that they're not sure whether they're going to get an income next year, depending on climate conditions, etc. And so they're reluctant to take on debt because they're unsure about their income. I like to say to people, councils aren't in that boat. Council income is very secure long-term. For most councils, I appreciate smaller rural councils struggle a bit, but most councils have a secure form of income. And even if the property owner can't pay in the short term, there's a security over the property that ultimately, I say to people, don't worry about it. You'll get the money back when the property changes hands in the longer term. So we have a secure form of income. I say to people, it's not unreasonable. In the long term, we've got to make sure that income offsets expenditure. Absolutely. And we've got to do that over time in a way that's fair to people today and tomorrow. That probably is going to mean those large lump sum capital projects need to be funded by debt. It also might mean that just like a large additional outlay and expenditure needs to be funded by debt, maybe a short-term large fall in revenue is exactly the same effect. We can borrow some money so that we can effectively spread that burden over time. Look, in a nutshell, people just need to think a bit more longer term and think about these issues a bit more than we traditionally have, given the nature of our secure form of revenue and capital intensive nature of our services.
Matthew, do you have a view on that as perhaps a broader perspective from the different sectors that you're working with?
Probably a little bit of a more nuanced view, I guess, is the way to say it. I think I agree with John that the utilisation of debt for future needs is something that needs to be considered. It's very difficult to work off a current income base when you've got a growing population and a growing call on the infrastructure requirements of a community. If you've got population growth and you need investment in assets, then it's got to come from somewhere. Now, traditionally, the local council concept there is to say, refreshing of your existing asset base is funded through your depreciation charge, and your revenue meets that need. So when you look at the nuance of debt, I think you've got to look at what you're using the debt for and what you're applying it to, and the outcomes from a strategic perspective aligned with what your communities need. So if I'm going to borrow, understand what I'm borrowing for, what it's going to provide, and ultimately if it's because population growth is going to be growing my rates and therefore my income, my ability to service and repay that debt is also going to grow. Now that means long-term planning. That means stress testing scenarios and understanding what the financial implications are for your organisation. I think what I'm a little less or a little more averse to is funding, using debt funding for short-term needs where you can't repay that debt out of your own sourced revenue. And I think that's where the stress on councils come in. If you don't have a lot of revenue that's coming in to manage that debt, then you may not have the choice about taking debt to smooth that revenue over the longer term. The serviceability and fiscal management, I think, constrains you in that respect. If you're a stronger council where you've got the ability to service debt, then yes, you can do what John's talking about. But that comes down to fiscal governance and trade-off decisions. So I tend to be a little bit more nuanced on debt in that respect. I certainly think debt is needed to enable you to meet future needs. I think you possibly need to find additional sources of revenue for some investments to offset that debt. So if you're looking at a business case around a facility that has a different revenue stream, then you need to take that into the equation for that debt as well. So I think it is a bit more nuanced, and the decisions that councils make, to John's point, need to be made over the longer term.
So taking all of that on board, what do you say to councillors? We have a lot of councillors that watch these programs, and I imagine some of them are perhaps yelling at the screen at the moment saying, but we've got to explain all this to our community, and our communities are also very conservative at times around councils taking on debt, and they already think we're not doing enough for the money that we're getting from our rates, etc. How do councillors have those conversations with their community to get to the sorts of outcomes that you're rightly saying we should be having?
I'll kick off, and I just would like to say that John's comments certainly have been my observations as well, and also I've had a lot of conversations with some CEOs who've thought long and hard about this concept of borrowing and the reluctance or resistance at a councillor level for all of those good reasons that John outlined. I mean, what the community needs to be aware of, as well as the councillors, is that these are sophisticated businesses, councils. They are multi-million-dollar business. The smallest rural regional council in Victoria would probably turn over $25, $30 million a year. They're not insignificant businesses. And then you, of course, go to the larger growth area councils that are turning closer to $300, $350 million a year. So there are multiple sources of revenue in addition to the rates. And that's through federal grants, also state grants, because these businesses deliver services on behalf of state and federal governments. And therefore, I think councillors need to start talking to their constituents about the sophistication and complexity of the business of local government, so that we can move away from this very somewhat outdated view of roads, rates and rubbish, and I guess change the narrative. But I'd be interested to hear what John's views are about this as well.
Thanks, Chris and Kathryn. Look, I was simply going to make the comment that the question that Chris has asked, I've had it raised with me many times in the past, irrespective of COVID. Councils who've been facing asset management challenges have said, oh, okay, we understand this now, but how do we tell our communities? My strong view is it's not easy, but having good, simple long-term financial plans, good, simple asset management plans certainly helps. My experience has been that those councils who've done this in the past have often made the plans too complex. So we need simple graphs and illustrative, understanding to help people be able to sell it to other people. So it's not just when I've done training, councillors said, oh, I get that. I say to them, well, you've got to be able to be me out in your community meeting now and explain that to your community. Not easy, but it can be done. So yeah, that's the focus we've got to do. Help staff have to present simple reports. The other one I was going to say, Chris, because I had a look at your background, I think local government audit committees have a role here. I was on a number of audit committees in South Australia, and it gives you a chance to be a little bit more intimate with the council members around a table, talking about issues, give them a little bit more confidence in the numbers when they're having those discussions with their community. So I know from experience, if there's probably a little bit more weight, rather than just saying, oh, we had a consultant that told us we should do this. If the councillor can say, we had a good discussion in our audit committee, and the audit committee made up of, locals and local community members, council members, maybe a couple of other people, if they feel confident, that can give a bit of confidence to the council to move forward as well.
That's a really good point, John, and perhaps it's a topic for another day to talk about how councils can perhaps make better use of their audit and risk committees, which I think is happening slowly. There are two other things I wanted to introduce, and we are starting to run short on time. The staffing issue that councils are dealing with around the country at the moment, and the fact that other levels, the Commonwealth has said that a state issue in terms of, the job keeper allowance not flowing through to councils. We're seeing some councils stand down staff. We're seeing others come up with some really innovative ways to redeploy staffs to avoid standing down, etc. I'm wondering what you as a panel are seeing and what sort of observations you would make about how councils deal with that issue.
Look, I'll kick off again. I was asked this question yesterday by the ABC, actually, and unfortunately, there has been a big impact for the sector, particularly with their casual workforce, and that's, again, not unlike other sectors. The JobKeeper package doesn't extend to the local government sector, as you indicated. The state government, though, has launched some other assistance through Working for Victoria, and some councils have actually looked at that program or that assistance package and have identified that they can employ additional staff through that to assist with, I guess, the different way and the different services that they're now offering through this environment. I think Moreland Council, for example, may have done some assessment on that. It might be worth having a conversation with them at another stage about that. But other councils have engaged some of their staff in different ways as well. I mean, the business of councils has to continue. There's still immunisation services, maternal child health. Libraries have changed the way that they're working, they're delivering to the residents in their community. We have staff who are assisting with creating virtual platforms to enable art gallery shows, etc. So, and you've probably heard of a few too, Chris.
I have, and some councils' areas are going to look absolutely spick and span like they never have, because staff have been redeployed to do things that they wouldn't normally be doing because their substantive positions are not required at the moment. I noticed New South Wales has reached an agreement in terms of an award, which I'm assuming the councils are clearly paying for. What's happening in South Australia, John? Have you any observations there?
Chris, no, I haven't. Look, in fact, I saw some information this morning where the LGA in South Australia had undertaken a survey of all councils in South Australia in terms of what they're doing. I must admit, I haven't heard that there's been talk of it, but I'm not aware of any councils that have stood down staff in SA yet. I'd probably say that clearly, if staff were providing a service, whether it's library services or swimming pool services that aren't currently being provided, that is awkward. The service isn't needed at the moment. Can those people do something else? Maybe not. So you may have to face those issues, but I'd be very reluctant to have a council stand down staff from services that will still be delivered and still arguably are needed and warranted in the community because of cash flow issues. I'm going to come back and say there's other ways of dealing with the cash flow issues. So that's not the immediate reaction. I don't disagree with anything that Matthew said earlier about stress testing scenarios, but I think unless those staff were doing things that are not able to be done anymore and they can't be redeployed to do other valuable things, I think laying off staff would be not the first thing I'd be looking at.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that. I think the councils are very much the people that run it and how they deliver services and impacts for the community. I think if you start to play with your one of your biggest assets, which are your people, then standing back up services or expanding services or getting them back online or whatever it is, and as we come out of this, that may be difficult for a council to do if they've taken that short-term decision to reduce costs where realistically the income still may be coming in. And to John's earlier point about deferral, that income's just deferred to a later date. That's where management of debt and short-term debt can offset the need to stand down staff. It becomes a pretty strategic decision when you're standing down an area that you may not need today, but you're going to need tomorrow, and not have a plan how to put it back on the ground. The loss of knowledge and skills out of that, if it happens, could be crippling.
Really good point. And Kathryn, quickly before I get to our last question.
Oh, well, I might be jumping ahead. I was just hoping to get a question in with John before we finish up today, just about the South Australian experience. John, so you mentioned earlier that you've had a chance to have a look at the Local Government Act here in Victoria that received royal assent recently. But of course, what is top of mind, and in fact an omnibus bill is being presented to Parliament tomorrow to allow for virtual council meetings in Victoria. And I know South Australia introduced that ability, was at the end of March, and I wondered what your observations of that, how's that going? What can we learn here from you?
Look, there's a couple of things. In fact, Chris and I had a chat this morning about one of those things. A month ago, I had never heard what a Zoom meeting was. What's Zoom? Have participated in a number of meetings, teleconferences, video conferences, Zoom or otherwise since. It's all worked pretty well, I've got to say, and it's pretty simple to use. Yes, you're right, Kathryn, that council in South Australia, the legislation traditionally was that you could have a committee meeting via a teleconference. So Little Country Council, if urgent audit committee meeting, I would sometimes do it on a telephone rather than drive up there, 3 hours for a half-hour meeting. But recently the legislation has been changed because of COVID, to allow teleconferences of council meetings that only came in 2 or 3 weeks ago. My understanding is it's all worked relatively well. There was a little issue in the media recently, sort of code of conduct. There might be dress or behaviour issues that you do in a council meeting. Is someone allowed to sit at their computer, participate in a council meeting, and obviously enjoy a glass of wine while they're doing it? Those sorts of things, we're gonna work through those sorts of things, I'm sure. But I have seen a couple of amusing videos and reports in the newspapers about people's behaviour with video conferences that they weren't aware of. So there are some tricks and traps to be aware of, for sure.
And look, certainly you're right, and there's an etiquette that goes with virtual meetings over Zoom or any other platform where there is that video capacity. I mean, the VLGA has been working with the state government to draft the guidelines that will sit behind the virtual council meetings. So, we've talked a little bit about that. At this stage, they're very high level, as they probably should be, because what everyone needs to remember is that there are already quite rigorous local laws and council meeting procedures in place. So if the council follows those, then all should go well. And I guess, yes, I have heard similar comments about perhaps the partaking of a beverage in a council meeting, but again, I'm sure the sector will get through that. Yes.
I think there's a significant opportunity for every organisation here. There's that great classic, don't waste a crisis. You see it a lot across a lot of businesses having to do things quickly and standing them up in a way that they would never have done before and doing it very, very well.
Mm.
And I think the ability for people to capture the impetus and the burning platform of today and turn that for how they might strengthen what they do, eliminate processes they don't need, become more efficient in delivery, have a greater impact on the community. Stepping back and thinking how you can capture this opportunity, and Zoom's just one discussion around, how can you diversify that so you can get, a more diverse input from people who may not be able to be on in a meeting room, but might be able to come into a meeting remotely that have equally as much input as someone on the ground. How we capture this, how we come out of this. If we come out of this as the same organisation as we went into this period, I think we've lost a real opportunity to think about how we might do things differently. And I think that should be across all of the pillars that we, that local governments look at their business, and maybe there are initiatives that need to be brought forward and thought about now around digital initiatives, around programs of work that can be captured because there's excess capacity or utilisation and staff that can be put to good use today. So I really do think there's an opportunity here if we just put our minds to it and think about it.
The other saying that comes to mind, Matthew, is it's an ill wind that blows no good. I've said that a few times in the last month or so. I did read that organisations in the past 90 days have done years worth of digital transformation work.
Absolutely.
Out of that.
Absolutely. And the ability to pivot too.
Yes. So to wrap up, I'm just looking for some takeaway messages, particularly for councillors who are currently with the Minister giving them more time to prepare their budgets. Many of them have gone out with their budgets on public exhibition. They're needing to make really big decisions about the future in the absence of all of the information that they feel they should have, the unknowns, the uncertainties, etc. What is your advice or some key takeaway messages from each of you, if you can, for how councillors could approach this complex and challenging task right now?
Well, I think my key one would be that we're not sure about the duration or the impact of COVID. Is it going to be short term? Is it going to be long term? Perhaps just be careful for a council to not lock into an outcome, a decision that doesn't have regard to that. We're a bit uncertain at the moment, so I'd be preferring to take decisions about deferrals rather than, abolishing or remitting rates fully. Perhaps doing a budget update if we need to when circumstances change. Avoiding the point that Matthew made, you don't want to lay off staff if you can avoid it, particularly given the issues that are going to be associated with ramping up again down the track. So, I'd be holding on for as long as I can until it's a clearer picture about the long term.
Good point. Matthew?
All of those things. I think I'd add to that. I always like a portfolio of decisions and a portfolio of actions to take, depending upon what faces the organisation moving forward. Decisions for short term aren't going to be the same decisions you make over the medium and longer term. So I think a portfolio approach is the right approach here. A single bet or a big bet in one direction really doesn't make sense to me because of the uncertainty, and that then lends any sort of analysis here to a scenario analysis. Look at a range of possible outcomes and a range of possible things that you might need to face as an organisation, and where you might best invest or control your expenditure over the next 12 to 18 months. And definitely the updating your position. A budget today might be out of date tomorrow.
Kathryn, final thoughts from you?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Look, a couple of things. I think that, that issue of digital governance is something that councillors should start thinking about, and the opportunities that lends for them in terms of the way in which they engage with their constituents. It was a question that I was also asked yesterday by the ABC, who felt that somehow that engagement with for councillors with their communities had somehow ceased. But of course, there are now all of these different ways right in front of councillors in which they can engage directly and probably even more quickly with their constituents. And I think what we'll find happening on the other end of this is an opportunity to have some of those conversations about, elected representation and direct representation and direct participation in our democratic processes. So that's probably at another level and for another conversation, but now is a time when councillors don't have their diaries busy with face-to-face meetings as they normally would do, to start having a think about the way in which they can engage with their communities.
Terrific. All right, we'll need to wrap this up somewhere. I get a sense we could talk for much longer, but I really do appreciate the time that you've all given to be a part of this conversation. I feel it's been very useful, and I hope the audience does as well. So John Comrie, Matthew Wilson and Kathryn Arndt, thank you very much for being with us on our panel today. That concludes this special edition of VLGA Connect, with thanks to our panel members for a wide-ranging and I think interesting discussion about the long-term economic impacts of COVID-19 on the local government sector, not just in Victoria, but more broadly. If you'd like to let us know your thoughts about VLGA Connect and what we can be talking about on future editions, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email to vlga@vlga.org.au. Thanks for joining us. See you again soon on VLGA Connect.